Welcome everyone to our JMTP videocast. My name is Melissa Hoag. I am reviews editor for the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy, and I also teach at Oakland University. I'm so pleased to moderate this discussion with my three colleagues, Tim Chenette, who is Associate Professor at Utah State University, Stan Kleppinger, who is Associate Professor at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and Stacey Davis, Associate Professor at the University of Texas, San Antonio. These three authors recently collaborated on a review of existing aural skills resources for the Journal of Music Theory Pedagogy. The result of their collaboration really went beyond just a review of existing resources and became more of a commentary on the state of the art of aural skills pedagogy as it is right now. And we all thought it would be a good idea for them to have the opportunity to just share some of their thoughts that didn't fit within their article, and just their thoughts on some of the things that got them really fired up as they were writing. And I know that they did get fired up. So let's start with a big question. What is the current state of aural skills instruction? How has aural skills instruction changed in the last 20 years, or has it not changed? What are the new materials, technological advances, and what has stayed the same?
Right. So one of the things that has stayed the same over a fairly long period, as far as we can tell, and this won't surprise anybody out there, is that we see in the materials this sort of two sides of the same coin, or at least we imagine them that way. On the one hand, we've got sight singing anthologies, and on the other hand, we've got ear training manuals. And then, of course, there are some texts that kind of do both. And we talk a little bit about that in the review. But so there's this metaphor that I think has spoken to people for a long time of the seeing ear and the hearing eye, which is a really powerful metaphor. Worth pointing out, though, that it means that we're always working with music that already exists, because you can't hear music that somebody hasn't made, and you can't read music that somebody hasn't written. So it does potentially leave some space for new things that we could do, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, in terms of people's own creativity.
Yeah, in some of our researching, we found kind of embracing of the field of cognitive science as it applies to aural skills pedagogy, which is a really wonderful introduction into this field that we've seen in terms of new directions and new information. As we think about that embracing, I think we can still find that there's not yet a lot of actual empirical research to investigate how these perceptual tendencies inform our teaching or enhance our acquisition of skills. So I can see that as a great avenue for future research, that we start supplementing discussions of best practices and anecdotal information from our teaching experience with some actual studies that gather data on those perceptual tendencies and have them inform our pedagogical practices and materials.
Yeah, I'll just say that that's something that's really exciting and interesting to me, is that I feel like in the last just few years, we started to see this convergence with research in music theory and music cognition specifically. Mm-hmm. And as Stacey said, the anecdotal side of what we all know works in aural skills classrooms, how we get our students to hear and image accurately. Tim and Stacey, chime in if you disagree, but I don't have the sense that really has emerged yet in the published aural skills materials for curricula yet, that kind of research and those kind of ideas are informing the kinds of things we see in published aural skills textbooks yet. But I see it's just around the corner, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It feels that way. There are some textbooks that do very explicitly go out of their way to incorporate some insights from cognitive science. But yeah, I agree that recent research definitely has yet to make its way into those published materials. So yeah. The other thing that I see as stable over the past period is a real emphasis on specific tasks. Of course, there's interval drills, triad drills. There's sight singing, and it's usually singing, and there's dictation. And that those are kind of the core of what I think people think of as aural skills. Also, we tend to see, if you look at a chapter list or a table of contents for these textbooks, often they track pretty well with a music theory curriculum, and there are obvious benefits to that. But it does mean that we're focusing very much on inputs. So what is the content, and what are the tasks? What are the things we'll do in class? And we're not necessarily always really explicit about exactly what the outcomes of all of these would be. And that may be one reason why there's been some stability here, because as long as we're defining the inputs, it's hard to change the inputs, right? It's hard to change what we're doing. If anybody out there is interested in curricular reform, we probably need to start by thinking about, well, what's the end point? So that's again, something we'll talk about later, I'm sure.
Yeah.
This is something that came up in the reviews that we did for the software technology packages in the review, that the technology has improved a lot in the last 20 years. So it's really interesting in light of how much the technology has improved and how ubiquitous it is and how available it is to all our students. How much, as Tim just said, the kinds of activities we have people doing with that technology have been relatively static, right? We're still looking at a screen and mousing around and dragging and dropping note heads or rhythmic values onto staff lines in order to build melodic dictations. And we're still, try to get 18 of the next 20 intervals correctly identified to go on to the next level, right? All of that has remained relatively just statics for 20, 30 years. And on the one hand, I guess it's a good thing. It's reinforcing the curricula you have, but at the same time, it's astonishing that there aren't more innovations in the kinds of things we could do with technology to reinforce oral skills inside and outside a classroom.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads us to thinking about this relationship between research and innovation and then our actual teaching resources, which was our original task, to survey the existing resources. And of course, you see that connection or lack of connection between innovations in the field that we all know are happening and static textbooks. And so how do we bridge that gap a little bit and start creating and implementing these findings of scholarship into our activities and materials and move innovations from individual faculty and schools into resources that can be available across the board in our field?
Right. Well, and that gets to another trend or lack of trend that I wanted to point out, which is something we'll probably talk about a little as we go along here. But it's that weird compartmentalizing of the oral skills curriculum in undergraduate programs, right? This is not something that came up directly through our study of individual textbooks and software packages, but something that we had that came up in our conversations, Tim and Stacey, which is that oral skills exists in most undergraduate curricula as this, this 4-credit thing, a 4-semester thing, 1 credit hour per semester for many of us, that meets twice a week for 4 semesters, and that's it. And yet we all know and acknowledge and have for generations how essential oral skills is to musicianship and to just making our way in the world as musicians, and our students developing and making the way in the world as musicians. There's this weird disconnect between the importance and the essentialness of oral skills as a thing we want students to get from an undergraduate music experience and the way it actually exists, tucked in a corner of the store over here in a 4-credit hour pocket taught by some music theorists at 8 o'clock in a dark basement classroom somewhere. And we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but that's something I've noticed that has not changed since I was an undergraduate.
Yeah, so I think this is something where I've complained about the stability of the curriculum before, if anybody's chatted with me about this. I think we could be moving in new directions, but I do want to shout out that there are some materials that are taking some new directions, and in directions like what Stan was just talking about in terms of application. Now, this doesn't solve the credit hour issue or any of those other compartmentalization things, but the Musician's Guide textbooks on the ear training side are really focused on real music, primarily on listening, so contextual listening. And I think that's great. That's an application to something students really do. There's also the Oral Skills in Context textbook, which has improvisation and has lots of real music for students to make in the classroom, lots of scores and things like that. And there are other textbooks that are doing some of this application too. But I think there's so much more that we could do in terms of applying what we're doing in oral skills to everything else the students are doing in their broader lives. A big one would be, for example, ensemble skills. So much of what they do is in ensembles. And so much of what we ask them to do in oral skills class is very much on their own and graded on their own. So I think there are a lot of directions we may be moving over the next years in terms of applying beyond the classroom.
Yeah.
Well, we're about out of time, and what Tim just said sounds like a really good concluding remark. And I think that we will save the rest of our discussion for the ensuing videos.